Welcome to The Aggregate, narrative coatings from around the globe. It's a show that salutes the close-knit community of architects, designers, builders, and artists from our world who refuse to ration their plaster passion. Amidst a world of click-and-stick emotions, the show celebrates the spoken word and forces us to listen, process, and grow. With an open and limber mind, these subtle connective moments will provide respite to recharge with an emphasis on shared techniques and knowledge, while simultaneously fueling our fires for continued creativity on and off the job site. So take a deep breath as New Age Artisans continues to coat the planet and change the paradigm of what it means to educate, empower, and create. Greetings, I'm your host Jeremy Mastretta, along with my man on the boards, Vincent Ryan, and welcome to the show. Hey everybody. Welcome back. This week's episode of The Aggregate. Doing some math. I think we're at number 9 now. It's been really fun. We're meeting people from our community, sharing stories and exposing some truth here and there. Last week we talked with Doug Muniz de Vargas about permaculture and natural building. Hopefully you got a chance to give that a listen. We discussed his Brazilian pigments, and the subject coincidentally came up and transition nicely into Mr. Scott Sutton, a.k.a. the Pigment Hunter, on social media. How's it going today, Scott?
It's good. Good to hear you.
Your
voice.
Yeah, buddy. Nice to chat again. Where are you today?
I'm up north of Taos in El Rito, New Mexico. It's maybe about half an hour from the Colorado border.
Oh, awesome.
There's a big valley called Sunshine Valley that's basically surrounded by volcanoes. You know, the Taos volcanic plateau field is kind of out in front of me when I look out the window, and back behind me is the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, which are basically the extension of the Rockies, Southern Rockies down here in the northern New Mexico.
I love the Sangre de Cristos. A lot of history in those mountains.
Pretty special place.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's putting it lightly. How's it going? Is it pretty dry down there yet? You guys have any snow? There was a snowfall that happened back in like Thanksgiving and then Christmas, and we had a little bit of a flurry, some snow the other day. Supposed to get some more tomorrow. I went out to my land, which is, I have a shipping container out there, and I'm basically kind of been house sitting up in the foothills for some friends. So that's where I'm at now, but my land doesn't have any power besides some solar stuff. It's off grid, so there's no water. So I went out there yesterday to try to do some filming, and it was sunny, but it was kind of windy and cold, and it got down to, I think it got down to below 0 the other day. Today, I think last time it was maybe down to 10. Oh wow, yeah, that's really cold. That part of the country.
It can get pretty cold, but it's beautiful. Yeah, there was about like a few inches, 6 inches of snow on the ground out of my land, and
nice.
So it's a little hard to get out there. I'm waiting for my truck, my 4-wheel drive truck, to get back into the new engine, so I can't get out to my land in the car right now. So I'm borrowing a lower 2-wheel drive car.
Yeah, low clearance. Yeah, it's about to get Arctic cold here, like Montana cold is what I call it. It's probably that real big weather system that's moving up from the south. Like I saw Alta, Utah, it's supposed to get like 20 inches. And when it pushes through like that, going west to east, it either will snow in Montana or it will create Arctic cold. And we're not getting any snow. We're getting 30 below 0 for 4 days straight.
Oh, wow.
Can't
wait.
Is that
starting tonight, or?
It's going to start setting in tomorrow, and then by the weekend, it's going to be clear and cold, 30 below 0. So No one's starting any cars, at least not any that I own, over the weekend.
Yeah, you're making it feel warmer down here then.
Yeah. Yeah. It's 2024. It's a new year. We're pretty stoked. What are a couple projects you've worked on so far?
I'm currently, I'm with my land. I'm trying to, create a residency program out on the 40 acres. And it butts up to the Rio Grande do Norte National Monument. So that property was owned by Chevron, who was the last owner of the Molychlor mine. It's basically a molybdenum mine that was here outside of Cuesta, New Mexico. And there was a bunch of land that was purchased for water rights to use at the mine for, moving tailings and stuff around. And now they're using some of the water for remediation purposes because it's a Superfund site. But all the land that they'd bought for water rights and transferred off the land was, kind of went on the market. And so I managed to get, and the 40 acres was like the minimum, piece of size they had. They have, other pieces that were 100 or 200 or 500. And so I managed to acquire a piece that I had discovered even back in 2018, and took 5 years for me to be able to manifest that.
Manifest it up. It's 40 acres.
Yeah, it's 40 acres. Yeah, but it butts up, like I said, the monument, the national monument, and the gorge is about a mile away. But the monument is on the other side of the fence, and so basically to the west is the gorge and the monument, and then to the north and the south is basically most of the monument as well. So the only other real privately owned land is to the east.
Mm-hmm.
And so that space, ultimately will become not just an artist in residence program. My interests, of course, are in art and using the natural pigments for making paints, which is where all this kind of started. But over the years, I've gotten interested in natural building and, in particular doing more hempcrete kind of projects, and see, of course, there's potential for using the pigments for paints and the plasters and stuff. But even my land has good soil for making adobe, or maybe using it for light straw clay, or doing a clay plaster, There's just different ways of using the materials around us. And so ultimately what I'm more interested in, how do we just, how can I create a space that is an educational and demonstration site and host artists and other people, whether it be scientists or farmers or, it could be musicians, it could be visual artists, it could be, so I want to have a space that will have kind of like a fabrication kind of shop with, kilns and for ceramics and glass and metal and everything from, paint processing stuff to 3D printing and CNC routing and laser cutting. So I'm kind of really just trying to create a space that has a bunch of tools for all the different mediums that allow us to kind of create our material culture of today. That's also basically, influenced by more past and traditional materials, and ultimately just really trying to focus on using local materials as much as possible, because that's, on this global economy, that's what's gonna make things more sustainable.
Yeah. How can you use what's readily available, what's at your fingertips directly underneath the land? And that is the number one thing. And as we progress as humans, I've noticed, and I'm just as guilty as most people. There are things that I could do that would very quickly cut down my carbon footprint, and I notice those, and I really do try. But if we're able to educate the general populace on how you go about using what's at your fingertips, then we can probably have a paradigm shift. I hope.
Yeah, no, I think, sometimes it takes more extreme situations for things to kind of focus back more on the local. And I think COVID in part did that a little bit, but it also, people are working from home, but also, local a lot of resources were, skyrocketed, as I'm sure building materials like lumber, 2x4s, went up to from $3 to $8 or whatever.
Yeah. I've had a little fence. We had this tree fall down. I remember in my yard, the tree fell down and it destroyed this fence, and I had to just temporarily fix it while I was waiting for the cedar manufacturer to, get their new shipment. So I just fixed it. And I think I put 3 2x4s up just temporarily a few years ago. And it was like $36.
Yeah.
What is going on here? But But then, the interesting thing about that is coincidentally, I noticed too that then the financing went way down.
Yeah.
So people were still building because they were getting money for cheap. So it's just this interesting struggle that we are a part of for sure. I know that you're about 4 years older than me. I'm almost 44. You 47, 48?
Yeah.
Awesome. And you grew up in Oregon on the Columbia River. And it seemed like you guys were always in touch with the land there. And then you decided that you were going to attend Oregon State. And you got a Bachelor of Fine Arts there. What sort of things did you study?
Well, actually, I went, when I grew up, like I said, like usually I was saying, I grew up on some acreage as well, in Oregon, and outside of Dalles, Oregon, and we had, horses and didn't really actually have any. My dad didn't like chickens and cows and pigs for some reason. We just boarded people's horses and had horses. And then we had an amazing orchard, and also a vegetable garden. That was basically just for personal consumption. It wasn't for commercial purposes. Mm-hmm. But my dad had, and some other family members, cousins, aunts and uncles had bought raw land and built from scratch out there, barns and garages and houses and stuff. And so, I think, being kind of born and raised out there kind of inspired me to be kind of where I'm at now. And I thought about actually going to school for veterinarian medicine, for my undergrad at Oregon State. And then when I got down there and kind of was listening to the talks about the program, I was like, I don't know. Anyways, so I just when I entered the program at Oregon State University, I didn't really have a major, planned. And I did some art, in high school, but in junior high. But I, eventually in my freshman year, I started taking some art classes, and that became the major. So I did everything, from, of course, drawing and painting and printmaking and sculpture. Not so much ceramics. It was mostly like kind of metal, classes. But I did mostly focus on a lot of it on painting. And that's really kind of actually why my professor, Sandy Brook, at the time, I was using oil paints. And I don't know if you're familiar with the art market, but, if you go to the art supply store, there's student grade paints and there's professional grade paints. Mm-hmm. And really the difference in between them is that the student grade paints has more filler in them than the professional grade paints. So you might have like 50 to 80% calcium carbonate or aluminum hydrate, as a filler to make, basically to kind of cut the pigment costs, but of the manufacturers so they can make more money. And then the artist grade paints still have fillers in them, just not as much.
Yeah. And the filler, I'm aware of the grades of paints, and I'm definitely 100% aware that, calcium carbonate is used as a filler in these paints. It's actually used, in roads a lot too, to give it some bulk, which is, I was pretty blown away by that. I'm like, really? You're using it? It's cool.
Yeah, it has, definitely lots of uses, and it's fine, to make, I understand pigment's not cheap, the man-made pigments, depend on which pigments you get. A lot of the basic earth pigments are cheaper, but, like the iron oxides. But the minute you started getting into like cobalt and cadmium and, phthalo blues and, different colors, they start to get up more in cost, like let's say $50 a pound compared to $5 a pound.
Yeah. Do you think that's because of the technique of harvesting the pigment or processing the pigment?
Yeah, all of those are basically, made in the lab. So, of course, all synthetic pigments have to come out of the ground in some form, in some element, and then they have to get isolated into basically probably somewhat of a pure element on, let's say, the periodic table. You'd have these different elements that the chemist would take and then mix them together, whether or not there's heat involved or different things, and then basically create a pigment out of it. So like cobalt as a raw ore isn't blue.
and so there's different processes that actually do that. And actually molybdenum from the molybdenum mine up here is actually looks like lead. It's like a silver. It's super soft. I found some at a local secondhand store, that came out of the mine, and, they actually used to use it as like a graphite replacement for a little while. But it requires a lot of heat. I think it's the third element on the periodic table that requires the most heat to actually to melt.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember if it's like some 3,000 degrees or something. So, but you can actually alter it and turn it into like an orange and a red pigment. And I think they use some of it for like rust prevention, like a rust preventing paint. It was used for drilling agent to keep the bits cooler. And so I think, a lot of the pigments that are used in the paints, they require either the raw ore is rare and hard to come by, and maybe the processes take longer, more steps to make to actually create the final product.
Yeah.
So there's value in it for sure, just as we, now with like, lithium and all these other things that are becoming more common in our appliances, our phones and tools, today that was popular and wasn't as consumed in the past,
Yeah.
And I don't know, I haven't really done any research to see how much a lot of these those synthetic pigments, how much of them are starting to be consumed. How much of it's left, do they have to find a different spot? It's the same thing kind of even with the natural pigments, like, lapis lazuli really only exists in Afghanistan and Chile in large quantities. There is a small little lapis mine that apparently is up in Colorado somewhere, but it never really got, mined to the point where it's like a commercial pigment. And here in the United States, by the time the U.S. kind of got colonized, there was, initially there were some pigment quarries, natural ochre quarries that were done on a commercial level. There's actually, I found a really cool report when I was back in Oregon that was produced by, I think it was the Army. And basically they were looking for pigments all around the Northwest to use for like camouflage colors. Because it was at the time, I think, when, World War II and, Japan was invading and whatnot. And so anyway, so they were looking for sources of pigments to use for camouflage, and there was a whole document that was written about that.
Wow.
Which actually had some pretty cool information about like pigment kind of like location kind of stuff,
Yeah.
And, so, really, by the time, I guess, artists really from like, let's say European based artists were settling in the U.S. and doing work, they'd already had shifted to a lot of the commercial based manufactured synthetic pigments, so this kind of that revolution of the industry had changed enough that even in Europe they were still using a lot of those historic mines for certain colors, but of course, there's all these new colors available that weren't available before when they got synthesized. So
go through manufacturing process to manipulate them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So there's definitely definitely reports of spots for ochre and stuff here, and you can look through like different platforms. The Bureau of Geology and Mineral Resources, for each state usually has some data out there of like what's happening. Of course you can just look at USGS maps, and if you can start to understand the geology or even soil, USDA soil maps, so there's different soils that are related to place and the underlying geology that have different colors. So there's different ways to find information out there, but if you're starting out, without that knowledge base or don't really know where to look, then basically, you can obviously just keep your eye out for color when you're on the field, and look for colors.
Look for color. Yeah. This is, this is in depth, no pun intended there. I'm a dad, so I like dad jokes. I'm just flabbergasted at this whole situation. You mentioned starting out. I mean, did you graduate with your bachelor's of fine arts in Oregon and then just decide like one day I want to be a pigment hunter? I mean, how does somebody acquire the drive to do this and learn and be so well versed? I mean, this is epic what you know.
Well, I mean, no, I mean, I guess, when I was in my undergrad, it, kind of started out with the professor showing me how to make the paints, because I was just using a lot of oil paint. I was using paintbrushes to some extent, but I was using a lot of palette knives. I was painting on big canvases, and I was kind of like inspired at the time by different arts, like the abstract expressionists. And so anyways, I was just using a lot of paint, and she was like, oh, well, you could buy pigment, and basically make your own paint, and it'd be more affordable. There's time and energy that goes into it, so you got to consider that. Even if you're buying pigment, like just molding the pigment with linseed oil or whatever binder and the glass molar just takes time. At that time period, I didn't have any mortars and pestles or sieves. None of that stuff was needed because I was buying pigment that was ready to be made into paint. Yeah. There was no processing of pigment that was needed. Mm-hmm. And when I got out of my undergrad, I moved to Portland. So I was at Oregon State from 94 to 98, and I moved to Portland in 99 and ended up working for a fine art paint manufacturer there for a few months, because of my interest in making paint. And then that's actually where I learned more about all the fillers and stuff that were going into paint and, that process. And so, yeah, I had, wear respirators and, I was, pouring big 50-pound bags of pigment into like a funnel and, breaking it down into smaller quantities because they were also selling pigment. And, I didn't really run the mills so much. I just fill paint tubes, but it was all very mechanical.
Yeah.
So I did that, and then I just kind of got really, a little bit frustrated with that industry because they were putting all these fillers in the paints, but there wasn't really a requirement for them to state that on the actual labels. Mm-hmm. And so it was a little bit of false advertising, and they had to, if you look on the back of a paint tube, it'll say they have to require to put down what pigment's in there in the binder, but they don't have to label the fillers. And so, like, if you look at the back of a paint, if you want to know what's in your paint, you look at the back and it'll usually say PR, PB, PG, PY. So P being pigment, B being blue, G being green, yellow being red, or excuse me, yellow being yellow, Y being yellow, R being red. And then they'll have a number associated to that. So there's actually a book called the Artist Handbook that you can look up, all those coded pigments, like PB, 15, I think is phthalo blue. Yeah. And so you could look up that, and it'll tell you what, safety wise, there's precautions about, if it's has any health issues or whatever.
Yeah, but they don't necessarily need to disclose that phthalo blue, has toxic additives to it. They just need to say phthalo blue's in here, and it's your job.
Yeah, they just have to say what's in there, the ingredients, and then if you want to, you can go do the research and figure out, sometimes I think the cadmium ones I might have say don't use this if you're pregnant or something like that, but other than that, like I don't see much information on the paints. And
if you're pregnant, you're gonna get the baby blues, the cadmium blues.
Yeah. So really a lot of that just kind of made me, at some point in time, I kind of started, after I worked in that paint company for a few months, I kind of it was just the management there was not very good, and I just ended up like leaving that job not too long, like I said, a few months, and then I ended up doing some after school art at Oregon College of Art and Craft as a painting teacher with kids for a summer, and then I hit the road with a buddy of mine in like I guess that was 99, and we actually drove down to the Southwest. Born in the Northwest, I hadn't really been down to the Southwest, and so I actually drove all the way down to basically to New Mexico and came to Taos, and explored a lot of mostly like Utah and New Mexico and hit a little bit of Arizona. But most of our time was spent hiking around, New Mexico, and then into, like we went to the Needles and
Arches and, Zion and did a bunch of backcountry stuff. And that's kind of where I first fell in love with New Mexico. And I knew I wanted to be here. And actually one of my friends that was working at the paint company had moved from Taos to Portland back in whatever that was, like late 98. And he's like, oh, you should go down there and make paints and sell them to artists. And so basically that's what I ended up after my road trip. I ended up back in the Northwest for a few months or closer to a year. I went up to Olympia, Washington, did some remodeling of a house in order to save money to move to Taos.
Move to Taos, yeah.
And so then basically, in 2000, I moved down to Taos, and actually, I came down here to make some paints and try to sell them to local artists. And so I rented a space, like an art studio, kind of live workspace, and started making paints and started kind of trying to connect with the community. There wasn't really internet at the time, so it was kind of like, really just meeting artists face to face, kind of like door to door sales.
Yeah, salesmen. Like you're selling Cutco knives, but you're selling legitimate.
Yeah,
yeah, it's awesome. It's awesome.
I think that company was actually called, that I had kind of created, was called Artra. It's like art and art backwards, ARTTRA. And anyways, nice. I mean, it didn't last for too long. I think ultimately made the paints. I had to educate people about what they're buying, right? So, and most artists were used to buying a certain Winsor Newton or Old Holland or whatever. And Old Holland back in the day was supposed to be one of those paints that didn't have fillers in them, and there's Daniel Smith's and all these different companies, and people are used to using what they're using, and they don't I'm always, interested in change.
Yeah. And then most people, I find people's ethics can bend very, very quickly when there's a dollar amount put on it. Mm-hmm. What did how did yours price out compared to your competition?
Well, I mean, I didn't have it. My whole point was I wasn't doing the fillers, right? And the thing with the fillers is that it not only makes it obviously cheaper for artists to buy and more profits for the industry to make, it basically kind of makes the pigments in the paints more cloudy, is actually how my professor at the time described it. And so if you imagine the way that pigment works is it's about the refraction of light. Mm-hmm. In paint and things that we see with our eyes, we're seeing the refraction of light off the material. And with paint, like the light is passing through the pigment particles, basically away from us, right? And hitting the canvas and then refracting back through the actual pigment particles. And so we're seeing that refraction of light through these pigment particles. So if you have, let's say, 50% chalk in there, that means there's less pigment particles of, let's say, the cadmium red for that light to bounce off of it, because it's also competing with the chalk.
Yeah.
And so it just, has less, vibrancy and less refraction of light happening, which those, modern day pigments, they're also concentrated strong anyways. It doesn't seem like it matters too much, but the big difference that you notice is actually from student grade paints to artist grade paints is that when you start to mix, let's say, phthalo green and cadmium red together, which technically, if you were to mix those complementary colors together, they would actually kind of create more of a muddy color, right? They would kind of create more of a brown.
Yeah. In my head, like purple. I'm like color wheel, I'm like moving around, like that's a brown. Yeah.
Yeah. So like purple and yellow would make more of a brown, blue and orange make it brown, red and green make it brown. But each one of those pigments has its own structure, form, and shape, and they all mix differently with oil. They have different oil absorption rates. And so if you were to make paints without adding the fillers, those, like, let's say that cadmium red and the phthalo green would actually interact more differently together, and they don't get as muddy as quick. Yep. So the more filler you have in there, the muddier they get. And the paints tend to feel the same, right? When they have, if they all have 50% filler, then you don't necessarily notice the individual qualities of each pigment, because they've all kind of been modified with something that makes it more even in terms of how it feels.
Yeah, it's been morphed.
And
yeah.
So,
yeah, it's got
like ultramarine blue was never used as like a thick which is the true lapis, was never really used as an actual like thick, paint that they would apply to the canvas. It was used more as a glaze.
Yeah.
Partly because when I was making the oil paints back then, I would have to like mix ultramarine on the slab with pigment and then let it sit overnight on the slab because the oil would like basically like separate from the pigment.
What's crazy? So ultramarine. Sorry to interrupt. I was like rewinding the clock here. We did this job in New York City, right on Fifth Avenue, and the sample was approved in a small little sample, and it was ultramarine blue pigment in this lime plaster mix, and we got going, and what we found was that ultramarine is not a stable pigment inside of lime, and there were walls that we were finishing, and if we had any little air movement or anything, it would just separate, and the lime would just eat the ultramarine. So there were certain walls that we had to redo and redo that were they were green. It was crazy.
I wonder, imagine that was probably maybe the manufactured replicate of lapis.
Mm-hmm.
And so I don't know if that would behave differently than like the real lapis, because I know that of course there were frescoes in Europe that used, ultramarine or lapis, but they also maybe didn't mix it directly, with the lime. Maybe there was a paint on top of the lime, so maybe it had more of a protective layer that separated the two, so there wasn't the chemical reaction that's with the lime was causing things to shift.
Definitely, and the frescoes, as far as I understand, you're integrating the colors in and you're painting into a curing lime plaster. So likely the reaction is at a different point.
Sure. Well, there's the frescoes where you paint it where it goes into the actual lime, and then there's the other fresco style that basically you're painting on top of a plaster that's not into a wet lime plaster.
Yeah, topical.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Dude, this is sick. This is epic. I want to take a quick break, and then when we come back, I want to hear all about your art projects, and I want to hear all about how you're integrating your pigment searching into these art projects.
Sounds good.
As you're likely well aware, our podcast series at Baby Brand is in its infancy. We promote these stories because there's a definite need to spread information about the sacred art form of plaster. It is no secret that as our world turns at its rapid pace, we are slowly losing techniques and methods. The information in this broadcast is an attempt at the preservation and conservation of sacred techniques and sage wisdom from the industry's finest. We offer financial compensation for all of our guests and are seeking advertising funds for operational costs. Do you have a product or service that is in line with our content? Do you want to advertise it to a wider audience? Give us a shout on our socials and we'll let you know how to get on board. And not to worry, we won't bother you with lots of show-stopping advertisements. We are so thrilled to share stories of designer disasters, contractor conundrums, or anything else that weaves its work through our plaster world. Do you have a plaster-related topic you'd like us to discuss? Or a guest you're dying to learn from? Send us a DM on Instagram at New Age Artisans or an email to hello@newageartisans.com. We can't wait to hear from you. Now back to the show.
Hey folks, welcome back. Thanks for listening to yet again another fun commercial break. We really are making some headway with some sponsors, and we're going to have some minimal ads, and I'm pretty stoked about it, so that's coming up. We were bantering, Scott and I, during the break about the desert and the powerful effects that it has on people in the world, and I was telling him this story of early 2000s, and I'd been a painter and was cutting rolling walls, and I just didn't like it. And I got invited on this trip down the Grand Canyon, and 18 days on the Grand, and I'm just cruising down the Colorado River, and I'm in this boat pretty much by myself every day, running these rapids and just doing the flat water and staring up at these cliff walls that were, thousands of feet up above. There's parts of the Grand Canyon where you're more than a mile deep and you're looking up at this sliver of the sky. And there's just these amazing walls with all these colors that are just pluming from the water straight up to the sky. And I made this pivotal switch in my mind. I said, I'm not going back home without changing the way I'm thinking. I'm going to take these colors in my mind and I'm going to manifest them onto walls. And plaster was the direction that I went with my mental art. So it's cool. It was cool to, hear that for you, Scott, that the desert was a catalyst for that. What types of art do you do now with your pigments?
Well, I did a big project, public art project down in Albuquerque for a community center that was a triptych. It was 3 8-foot by 8-foot panels, birch ply that basically made, 8-foot by 24-foot. And that was entirely painted with either, minerals, pigments that I had gathered from the Albuquerque kind of basin, the Middle Rio Grande Basin, or from pigments that I extracted from plants like the indigo that I'm growing up on Taos. And so that, in that project really also combined some 3D modeling and CNC carving of the Sandia Mountains in the middle of that. I made a 3D map based off of USGS digital elevation models and then had that carved 3D. The center panel was 3D and the 2 flanking panels were 2D. And then I painted a geology map of the area on top of that with those pigments that I had collected from those different geology layers, and of course, the waterways kind of being the blue from the indigo that I was growing up north in the watershed. Wow. And so, I was really trying to, kind of combine my undergrad, of course, of fine art and making paints with these experiences I've had over the years with kind of collecting pigments, and then getting more into growing plants after I had gone to grad school at UNM from 2009 to 12 for landscape architecture, and so that mapping became more a part of my life. And so that's kind of where it's kind of like this hybrid of influence between these different educational degrees that I'd gotten that have kind of merged together.
Yeah, and, you're like niching. You're niching in a niche, which is unheard of. The other thing that you said, and I did a double take when you said it, you're the first person I've ever heard of that has grown plants for the use of pigment. Is that a common practice in the world?
I mean, indigo has been used, for, in cultures all around the world, for dye purposes and also for pigment. It's, you can make lake pigments with other plants, like madder and Dyer's chamomile and a lot of native plants like the chamiso, the rabbit brush. Basically the lake pigments are a dye that you precipitate onto these kind of, like alum and soda ash. And so you basically make your dye and then you add a certain percentage of alum and soda ash to that, and then they have different pH, right? One's more acidic, one's more alkaline, and so they react and kind of bubble up, and then the dye actually bonds to those mineral salts of sorts, and then you end up with then you can strain off all the extra liquid because all the dye that's bonded to those physical pieces. It's kind of like the fillers, that they use in the paints of sorts, but different. But those actually settle to the bottom. And then you can pour off all the clear liquid. So with indigo, you have to harvest the leaf and then put it in, a barrel or container and kind of basically make like a sun tea. You could let it heat up in the sun for a few days. And then that leaf starts to break down and the pigment that's within the leaves kind of gets released from that. And then you strain off the leaf once it kind of once the water turns kind of like this emerald greenish color. And it usually has kind of like a coppery film on the top. And then once you pull the leaf out, then you actually add, you want to raise the pH to around 10 or 11. And so you add, sometimes you're adding, I guess you could add soda ash, but most people are adding like a calcium hydroxide lime, to raise the pH of that indigo, tea.
How high does the pH have to go?
Usually it's around like 10 or 11.
Mm-hmm.
And then you aerate it as well. You have to add oxygen. And so that, basically, kind of bubbles up and foams when you're aerating it. And that actually forms the indigo pigment, which then has to drop and settle in that water. And then you decant or, scoop off the clear liquid off the top, and you have a paste in the bottom. And so it's been a practice, that's existed for years. And indigo occurs in all kinds of different plants, different plant families around the world. And so like in Europe, you had woad, which is a mustard family, and the Japanese indigo is Persicaria tinctoria, which is the buckwheat family. And a lot of the indigo that's grown in more humid tropical climates is from the pea family, the Indigofera. And so to me, it's just amazing that people all around the world, all these different cultures all around the world, had somehow over time figured out that this plant had contained color in its leaves, and had, started to integrate it into their own culture, into their own art form, which is more tied to place. And that's, I guess, kind of what my whole experience from using the synthetic pigments was, that I was so displaced from where those materials and disconnected from where those materials came from and the processes it took to make them. I just go to the art supply store and buy them, and you're just like, great, you can instant gratification of painting with color, but it's like growing your own food or supporting local farmers. How do you do that, in the art world, And so that's kind of really, when I was here in Taos making paints in early, from 2000 to 2003-ish, I had gone to Abiquiu for a hike. And like you said, with the Grand Canyon, I had seen all these colors in Abiquiu area, which is where Georgia Keefe, had lived and painted. And I just had thought she did so much. I don't know if I'd consider her a plein air painter, but she did a lot of paintings that were inspired by a place, but none of her pigments or paints were actually made from the local stuff that she was painting. So especially as a plein air painter, where you're painting on site and you're trying to capture the colors of what you see in front of you, it seems like, using the local materials would make the most sense. And that's kind of where I had that kind of, awakening of sorts of like, why didn't, this material get used? So actually I collected some material from my hike that day, and I brought it back to my paint making studio in Taos, but I didn't have the mortars and pestles and the sieves. And then, so I basically, once I moved back to Portland, I, had actually brought this stuff with me and kind of just held on to it as, this geological artifact, that, I just admired, but I didn't really have the knowledge or tools to process it. And so that kind of is what inspired me. New Mexico, that time in New Mexico had kind of, brought this color to my eyes, and there are places in Oregon too, like, if you go over to the John Day fossil beds and the Painted Hills National Monument, there's a lot of colorful earths exposed there, like there is in Utah and in other places in the Southwest, but a lot of places in the Northwest, a lot of the vegetation is grown over the soils and the geology formation, so you don't really get to see a lot of these colors, with your eyes, because they're all covered in vegetation, or if you're in a city, they're covered with concrete and asphalt and buildings, and so that was really kind of what triggered my thought of color in being used, from the land, that really creates a sense of place. And two, as well in Taos, a lot of the traditional architecture being adobe with clay plasters, and a lot of times they'd use a local white
clay as a plaster on the inside of these buildings to make them more luminous, more light, because there was obviously not as many opportunities to buy big windows, so you're just trying to do what you could to like lighten up the inside of the space.
Yeah.
So there's a place called Tierra Blanca that was like a traditional spot south of Taos that people, from Taos Pueblo and later the Spanish cultures used as their whitewash plaster. So I think that really, back to, again, trying to like, how can you create a sense of place, using local materials, and we've a lot of the structures now in New Mexico are just timber frame structures with fiberglass insulation and ply OSB and chicken wire and this concrete stucco and then some kind of synthetic pigment that's supposed to look like, a natural clay plaster.
Yep.
And that's like especially in Santa Fe, they have restrictions for if you build within a certain area, you have to match this vernacular, even though the entire substrate of it is non-natural.
Yeah, you have to match the aesthetic vernacular.
Yeah.
Yeah, sure, but they're not really regulating as far as if you're using actual historic materials.
Yep.
They just want it to look like it. Yeah, that sounds pretty standard. So the art that you are doing with all these pigments currently, I've seen the photos online. We'll have some links in the show notes to them. I'm really just blown away, especially at some of the the public art that you have done. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you integrate your pigments into those? And is it entirely your pigments that are being integrated into these projects?
Yeah, that mural piece down in the Taylor Ranch Community Center it is all local material that I collected from around the Albuquerque area. I'm trying to think of, maybe it was like 60-mile diameter kind of circle of area that I covered, where I went out and collected. So I did all the research, looked at a lot of the geology maps to kind of inspire where to go to look for materials. And so with the geology maps, you can see what the underlying kind of like bedrock layers are. And so some of those, with the geology maps, they have like a legend, right, that describes the different layers. And a lot of them are sedimentary layers. Some of them are more of volcanic origins. So, really for pigment purposes, you can use materials that are, let's say, something like azurite, malachite, or lapis, more like more gemstone kind of stuff, right? But most of what I've been using over the years is actually kind of more of a clay-based, different colored clays. And so when I'm looking at geology maps, I will use that as a guide nowadays to look for, let's say, some of these sedimentary layers, and they'll say something along the lines. Sometimes they actually describe what kind of colors of clay might exist within those layers, but usually they'll say whether or not it's like mudstone, siltstone, sandstone, or if it's conglomerate, and of course it's volcanic, then it might be basalt or granite. And so usually I'm looking for the sedimentary layers because those are basically geology layers that have been formed over time by eroding landscapes that have been then deposited in old, ancient inland seas. And so basically those mudstones and siltstones and sandstones have settled through like natural navigation processes over, millions of years. And, maybe it happened, in a short period of time, or geologically speaking, but it might have occurred millions of years ago. And then those have been deposited in these layers. And I don't know how much navigation process you do, but like if you wanted to collect a material to make clay or plasters and or use them for paints, you can collect the raw materials and basically, so if I identified on a map that like, hey, here's an area where there is a nice mudstone, well, the mudstone is like the finest of material, right? And the siltstone has a little bit bigger particle size, and the sandstone's bigger.
So you can use levigation if you had to collect some sandstone and you didn't want the sand in it, you could use the levigation where you put the material in a bucket of water, stir it up and let the sand settle based on weight. And then the fine particles are floating. Then you can kind of pour off the fine stuff, the colored water, right? And then you could have you could separate the sand from that if that's what you want, right? So like ceramics, you want some sand, you want some particles in there so it prevents cracking. Plasters is probably not, you also probably want some sand, so it's probably not quite as important in terms of refining it. But if you're going to make oil paint or watercolor, you don't want any of that grit in it, right? So you really have to refine it. And that levigation is one way to do it, and that's one way that nature had done it, and so if you you can just go out in nature and go on a hike or a drive and just keep an eye out for color. But ideally, what you want to find is something where nature's already done the majority of the work, where if it was a mudstone that it was already created and isolated by those levigation processes that happened over time, then you can just selectively collect materials from areas where it's kind of eroding out of the hillsides. And so a lot of the places, for instance, in the geology maps, you can also look at fault lines. Look for fault lines on the geology maps, which are usually marked by just a black line. And where those fault lines occur, you usually have uplifts. And so you have usually layers that have been kind of distorted and tilted up and exposed where normally they'd be hidden, right?
Yeah.
And so those are really good spots to also go and look for materials or in those areas where fault lines exist. And so that's when I started to do that public art piece, I was familiar with the area because I, had done grad school, 10 years prior down in that area. But, I was trying to kind of create the composition for the work of art, which was really talking about the different, it was talking about watersheds and it was talking about the geology and talking about the ecosystems that live there. So in the paintings, there was different species that were kind of native to the area, and there's like the Mexican gray wolf, and, the hawk moth, the sphinx moth, and there's beaver and these different kind of keystone species that were part of that. And one of the panels was focused on like night species. They were active at night. Another panel was focused on kind of like the day to the east. So like first the eastern panel, what's related to the sun rising had a hummingbird and monarch, kind of more species that would follow the sun and migrate kind of deal.
Yeah.
With the seasons. And then the western panel was more related to the sun setting basically, and the night species. And also species that were more, that didn't migrate as much, that denned, right? So the hawk moth and the owl and the Mexican gray wolf. And so anyways, they're all species that kind of denned into place, right? And were rooted in place. And then that center panel was the 3D carved panel that was all covered in, the geology layers. The geology layers are painted on top of the 3D surface.
Yeah.
But all the panels were painted with the earth pigments. And so I tried to take it as far as I could, with, using the local materials, at least with the paint. Of course the material was, it was a bunch of laminated birch plywood for the 3D carving, and the other panels were birch plywood too that I painted on.
Yeah, we'll definitely get those links to that up in the show notes, because I was very taken when I saw those. I'm just thinking out loud here as you're talking. I'm just listening, and I'm so captivated by what you're saying. But as far as I can tell, you have a bachelor's of fine arts, which is an understatement. You have a degree in landscape architecture, but you're also very studied in the School of Hard Knocks in horticulture, in cultural preservation. I mean, there's so many things that you are talking about right now that you're becoming. I mean, I hate to be like so ethereal here, but you're like a conduit of sorts for this access into the natural world. And I'm just like, Jesus, who is this guy? This is wild. Do you know of anybody else in the world that does what you do? I'm just a question.
I guess, through the social media platform, I've been fortunate to meet lots of incredible people, around the world that are working with mineral pigments for a variety of purposes and the plant-based pigments. I think I'm fortunate that I just, full circle all these different my life experiences, where I, ended up, doing my undergrad in fine art and then doing the landscape architecture, like kind of just, it just adding layers on top of layers that, not even knowing where the end, the end game is, and so I think it kind of just, coming back to New Mexico and actually now thinking about approaching, I'm actually going to be, doing a historic preservation certificate, which is like 18 credits at UNM. I could have done it when I was in grad school, but it wasn't really in my, my bandwidth at the time, I guess. And anyway, so that certificate's really interesting because it could cover a lot of things from restoring historic buildings. It could be looking at, iconographic paintings, the Spanish who, settled New Mexico also used somewhat of like local material pigments for their paintings. And of course, the Pueblo culture that's still, of course, alive today, and still collects and uses materials for pottery and paintings and stuff. And so there's a lot of that stuff still alive. Not every artist and every culture is using traditional materials, but there are some that are. And I think, this platform, around the world is kind of, especially with, Instagram has kind of at least allowed me to connect with people that, are using those and or trying to reinvigorate it at the same time, to lessen our impact on the environment and kind of tapping back into place. And I think I was really fortunate, when I did go back to Oregon, in 2003, back to Portland and settled there. And I, was trying to figure out what to do. And that's kind of where I had gotten involved, eventually with the Cultural Lifeways program through the Confederated Tribes of Grand Ronde. I basically had an opportunity. I'd walk into their offices to ask them some questions about some words within the Chinookan, language. And that ended up creating a dialogue where I, when I actually walked into their offices, I saw that they had a classroom where people were doing some carving and beading and weaving. And so we just started talking and they're like, "Oh, what do you do?" And I was like, "Well, I'm an artist. I make paints." But I was making paints again with the synthetic stuff. And so they're like, they asked me if I wanted to teach paint making and painting to, as part of their Lifeways class. And I was like, yeah, that'd be great. But I don't want to use these manufactured pigments from these giant chemical corporations, and so that's really what gave me from like basically that happened around like 2004 to almost around 2009 that I did that. But that's really what opened up my world and my mind, to, because I started to have to learn about this culture that I had grown up within, but had no idea, in schools, public school, none of that stuff talked about it. So I, was able to learn, from these individuals, tribal members, who had knowledge, but a lot of what the knowledge I also learned, I started to collect, old ethnographic texts that had documented, stories, about coyote or grizzly bear or the bald eagle or whatever, that would basically kind of talk about it. The stories would integrate elements of place into them. So sometimes they might talk about color in the stories, but they wouldn't necessarily be like, "Oh, this is where the color came from." But it was a source of knowledge. And sometimes they would talk about like, maybe there was like a blue that was collected near here, or like, in the video that I have on my website, it talks about, grizzly bear falling off a cliff
and where he hit the ground and stained the ground red.
Oh yeah.
But it doesn't talk about that particular spot, you know? So it's like, well, how do you find those places, you know? And at that time I didn't have the experience with the mapping, that I do now. And so I was literally just going out in nature and like looking, you know, hiking, driving through mountains, hiking along, you know, shorelines, along rivers or along the ocean, and just looking for places where things were revealing themselves to me.
We're definitely
a lot of it's just stuff that's eroding out, right, out of the land and kind of giving itself to you. So I'm not having to necessarily go out with like a shovel and just digging in some arbitrary spot, like beneath the grass and looking for something. I'm looking for something that's already kind of showing itself.
Yeah. Well, that video that you were talking about, I remember, you know, being on Instagram and seeing the pigment hunter and then kind of intrigued and going down the rabbit hole. And I remember I came across that video and I was like, who is this guy? Like, this is all time. We're going to put that in the show notes because everybody in the world needs to see that. It's just like this little access, this little window into your life. And I was very taken by it. So that's going to be up there. The beginning of the show, we were talking about, you know, the land that you're on and what you want to do with it. But I want to talk a little bit more about the education piece that you were just talking about, because clearly you also have a nice degree in education as well. School of Hard Knocks. Moving forward, what are some of the educational components that you'd like to celebrate with the paints and possibly plasters?
Well, I think, you know, this summer I basically closed on that land deal last January. So I've owned the land for about a year and, you know, I haven't really done much out there. I had a lot of projects that were gardening and caretaking of other properties, in and around Taos and Cuesta. And then I just, of course, you got to have economic finances to drill a well and do all these stuff and buy materials for building. And so I got my shipping container out there. I've also just been sitting with the land to, you know, observe different things, trying to identify where I want to put the well. So I've been doing some water dowsing to try to determine where that will be and how that will impact where the buildings will go and where the greenhouses and the gardens might go.
Yeah.
And then, you know, ultimately I need to buy some local, they're luckily up north of here in Colorado. There's some local sawmills that have some beautiful material that I can use for like post and beam or timber frame structures. So ultimately I want to get some structures kind of built, even if they're just smaller, like basically the bones of the structures. You know, I haven't gone through any of the permitting processes. I do work in like 3D modeling programs like Rhino, and, you know, I do a lot of GIS, you know, mapping. And so right now I've created like a 1-inch contour map of my property of the whole 40 acres so I can look at the flow of the water. And then I'm also through the water dowsing trying to identify where all the underground veins are. And so I'm really just trying to layer these different things, one on top of the other, to ultimately decide where I want certain things to go. And ideally I'd like to get some structures built that kind of become a place for maybe workshops to happen, in the sense that, like, if I have the timber frame structures get built, then I could do like a stem wall that goes around those structures, and they could be, you know, on top of that stem wall, there could be, you know, adobe or different materials that are built up, and then, you know, starting to plaster and paint on top of those, right? So yeah. I feel like the potential for multi-dimensional like workshops to happen, that give people like hands-on learning, and I feel like that's something that I was really grateful, you know, in graduate school, but so much of it was, you know, on the computer and theoretical, conceptual, not a lot of hands-on learning. And so my hope is to create more opportunity for that. And luckily when I was in grad school, I had the opportunity to work in the fabrication lab all 3 years, you know, where I had access to like the CNC router and the laser cutter and the metal, you know, and the woodworking materials. And so that kind of, you know, gave me some of what I needed in terms of hands-on experiences. But my hope is to maybe try to create maybe somewhat of a partnership with UNM where I could create opportunities for students to come out and do design build stuff that's similar to like Rural Studio, or I guess, there's other programs that are out there like that, but nothing really here in New Mexico. And then just trying to tie back to place, a lot of the buildings that are here, there's a lot of mobile homes in this area, which aren't, obviously energy efficient and definitely not local, and it's like, how can we get back to kind of creating places that are healthy homes that are affordable and that are using these local colors and pigments and plasters and paints. And so these structures that we built, could be like walls that people come in to help build, and learn. And then they could be kind of combined. If I lay them out in a way, they could become part of a bigger structure later on when I need to pull permits. So I'm trying to design something that can be kind of built modular that then can kind of be orchestrated, to create a bigger space.
Yeah.
But then also opportunities for people to come and learn how to make hempcrete or make adobe or do a clay plaster or do an Elise paint, on top of it.
Yeah.
So there's that. I'm really in a pretty remote area. There's no real, Denver airport is 4 or 5 hours away. Albuquerque is close to like 3 hours or so from here. There's a small airport in Taos. So getting people to come out here is a little bit harder. And so I guess part of what was great about my experience with working with the Comparative Tribes of Grand Ronde's Cultural Lifeways class and teaching there is that it was like so rooted in place, because of course I was working with the people that are from the place, and I learned so much through that experience, through them. Because we weren't just out collecting. We would also go out and collect, a cattail for basketry or cedar bark for hats. And so I was helping kind of to identify and, map out places for future knowledge.
Yeah.
Of future generations to have access to where these places existed or exist. And so I think for here, it's like, how do I do that? How this community, a lot of the housing situations here aren't rooted in place anymore. And so how do we switch that, and whether or not it could be the same, could be said for different types of art. And so I think for me, if I can go to a place and work with a group of people, that makes a lot more sense than like people visiting me to take a workshop on paints making that are coming from, let's say, out of state. Because then there's, of course, just a huge, ecological carbon footprint if people are having to travel miles and take a plane and rent a house and, eat out, whatever. And so I think ultimately I want to have the land-based artist the residency program exist that allows for local community to participate and people to visit, but for longer periods of time.
Yeah, kind of like a Canelo sort of curriculum.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yep.
And I really need to go down and visit them too.
Yeah, I should.
I actually have their Straw Bale House book that I've had for years and never like connected. Now I'm just like I actually know plenty of people that have I've been involved with it and have gone down there and taken workshops from them. And so Bill and Athena Steen are amazing. And but yeah, so my residency program would be like one thing that'd be rooted in place, but then I really want to create a mobile lab either that I've been designing out in either like a step fan or potentially a box logical because it's lower down in elevation, but just getting into it. But the idea is with the step fan is a mobile art lab would be to travel to different communities and do stuff. And within that, I would have like paint making stuff. I would have a CNC and maybe like a press for doing like wood blocks or etchings. And so basically I can kind of have different equipment within there that I can go and visit like schools or different communities and kind of use that as a base to teach classes and also try to just do more actual public art projects. And really I want to not just teach classes. I'd like to actually
teach a class or educate, provide educational experiences, but then create something collaboratively out of that, right? Like, how do we give them that hands-on experience so they're not just, it's great that they can come and just like learn how to process pigments, whether or not you're using levigation or using sieves or to sift the pigments or whatever it is in the mortar and pestles or ball mills, there's different, depending on how much oil you need to process, there's different, things that you might need, so like with clay and plaster, you just need more volume, right?
Yeah.
But pigment, you just need more refined material. And so ultimately I think I want to kind of combine, the education with community engaged kind of art projects,
Yeah. Well, I think that the number one thing in anything in life I've realized is just awareness. And then once you have awareness, it's everybody's, everyone's wish. They can do what they want with the awareness that they have. They can dive deep and they can start integrating, what they've learned, or they can decide, oh, maybe this isn't for me. Maybe I want to go in a completely different direction. Yep. But the awareness is key, and it takes somebody with a lot of knowledge to raise that awareness for people. And in the world of pigment, in the world of art, in the world of culture, I think it's Scott Sutton that's doing it. And I would love, if there's any way that New Age Artisans can help you moving forward, just please don't be shy and let us know. I would love to integrate, our skill set and what we can offer into anything you're doing, because I think it's really awesome. It's really awesome.
Well, thanks, Jeremy.
Yeah. My pleasure. That's easy. That's easy. Doing the work that you're doing, that's the hard part. So it needs to be.
Well, I'd be happy to have you guys come down and help. We can coordinate some workshops down here if you want to do anything hands-on.
Yeah, and let's make it happen. We'll just.
I'd love to come up and visit you guys, and again, trying to bring some things on the road. I'd like to. I don't really harvest the pigments to sell them or make the paints to sell them. I'm using them for my own application, and ideally, I'd rather visit other people and help identify sources of materials that can be used for their own projects that are closer to home,
Yeah.
And so really I try to use art as a way to educate people about the places they live, and back to the landscape architecture degree and my time working with the Confederate Tribes of Grand Ronde really just opened my mind and the ideas I had of what place is and how that can really be we can connect. Even if you're not rooted ancestrally to a place, you can still learn and observe through observation or through doing research online, reading books, or finding different sources. If you're fortunate to connect with someone that's rooted, as an ancestral person of that land and have ability to receive any information from them, then you're really lucky, but that's not always the case. So I think as individuals, if you're not from a particular place, then you should be doing as much as you can to learn about that place and learn about the cultures. And because that's really the beauty of the world, is that each place is truly unique based on the underlying geology and that topography that's a result of that geology, and the hydrology that basically then feeds the ecosystems and the cultural layers that have been basically, have lived and died over the years on those lands, and so, really, if you want to do justice to the environment and the cultures and the people, and trying to understand the colonial nature of human history around the world, it's again kind of like tying back to place, and I think learning about these layers from the natural environment that even predate many of the human layers is one of the ways to do it. And you have to do your own research in order to educate yourself. And that's, for me, I feel like that's why the geology maps and looking at the ecoregions and learning about your watershed and where that water is going and, what it does, in terms of bringing life to, the planet, that we're fortunate to live on, is the best way that we can kind of connect to place.
Yeah. That's a humble perspective, and I celebrate it, and I appreciate it. Thank you so much for joining us. All these people that we're talking to, there's going to be, now there's going to be a Scott Sutton 2.0. And it's going to be when you and I go to the Canelo project together, because I also need to make a trip down there. It's sacrilegious as a plasterer that I haven't been there. Thank you so much. I can only imagine how excited everybody is going to be when they're listening to this. This has been beyond educational and inspirational. So thank you. And let's stay in touch, buddy. Okay.
Sounds good. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thanks,
buddy.
Guys. Thanks. Thanks for listening, everybody. Please join us next as we talk photography with our friends Dan Armstrong and Whitney Kaman right here in our Bozeman, Montana studio. Dan, a Montana kid, snapped action sports images for years for Powder Magazine and other outdoor companies like Patagonia until shifting his focus to branding and architecture. Whitney, a Minnesota native, has had her authentic images grace the covers of countless magazines across the globe, including Architectural Digest, the Los Angeles Times, and Dwell. Together, we'll have a think tank conversation about the importance of a quality image that celebrates texture and the techniques involved in capturing the true essence of a plaster wall. We'll even do a little verbal demo on how to snap a quality smartphone image. Until next time, cheers!